First Book, First Aspect, Sections 10 through 12, of The World as Will and Idea. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The World as Will and Idea, Volume 1, by Arthur Schopenhauer, translated by R.B. Haldane and J. Kemp. First Book, First Aspect, Sections 10 through 12. Section 10. Through all this, the question presses ever more upon us, how certainty is to be attained, how judgments are to be established, what constitutes rational knowledge, Wissen, and science, which we rank with language and deliberate action as the third great benefit conferred by reason. Reason is feminine in nature. It can only give after it has received. Of itself it has nothing but the empty forms of its operation. There is no absolutely pure rational knowledge except the four principles to which I have attributed metalogical truth. The principles of identity, contradiction, excluded middle, and sufficient reason of knowledge. For even the rest of logic is not absolutely pure rational knowledge. It presupposes the relations and the combinations of the spheres of concepts. But concepts in general only exist after experience of ideas of perception, and as their whole nature consists in their relation to these, it is clear that they presuppose them. No special content, however, is presupposed, but merely the existence of a content generally, and so logic as a whole may fairly pass for pure rational science. In all other sciences reason has received its content from ideas of perception. In mathematics, from the relations of space and time, presented in intuition or perception prior to all experience. In pure natural science, that is, in what we know of the course of nature prior to any experience, the content of the science proceeds from the pure understanding, in other words, from the a priori knowledge of the law of causality and its connection with those pure intuitions or perceptions of space and time. In all other sciences everything that is not derived from the sources we have just referred to belongs to experience. Speaking generally, to know rationally, Wissen, means to have in the power of the mind, and capable of being reproduced at will, such judgments as have their sufficient ground of knowledge in something outside themselves, in other words, are true. Thus only abstract cognition is rational knowledge, Wissen, which is therefore the result of reason, so that we cannot accurately say of the lower animals that they rationally know, Wissen, anything, although they have apprehension of what is presented in perception, and memory of this, and consequently imagination, which is further proved by the circumstance that they dream. We attribute consciousness to them, and therefore, although the word Bewusstsein is derived from the verb to know rationally, Wissen, the conception of consciousness corresponds generally with that of idea of whatever kind it may be. Thus we attribute life to plants, but not consciousness. Rational knowledge, Wissen, is therefore abstract consciousness, the permanent possession in concepts of the reason, of what has become known in another way. Section 11. In this regard, the direct opposite of rational knowledge is feeling, and therefore we must insert the explanation of feeling here. The concept which the word feeling denotes has merely a negative content, which is this, that something which is present in consciousness is not a concept, is not abstract rational knowledge. Except this, whatever it may be, it comes under the concept of feeling. Thus the immeasurably wide sphere of the concept of feeling includes the most different kinds of objects, and no one can ever understand how they come together until he has recognized that they all agree in this negative respect, that they are not abstract concepts. For the most diverse and even antagonistic elements lie quietly side by side in this concept. For example, religious feeling, feeling of sensual pleasure, moral feeling, bodily feeling, as touch, pain, sense of colour, of sounds, and their harmonies and discords, of right, of wrong, sense of truth, aesthetic feeling, feeling of power, weakness, health, friendship, love, etc., etc. There is absolutely nothing in common among them except the negative quality that they are not abstract rational knowledge. But this diversity becomes more striking when the apprehension of space relations presented a priori in perception, and also the knowledge of the pure understanding, is brought under this concept, and when we say of all knowledge and all truth, of which we are first conscious only intuitively, and have not yet formulated in abstract concepts, we feel it. I should like, for the sake of illustration, to give some examples of this taken from recent books, as they are striking proofs of my theory. I remember reading in the introduction to a German translation of Euclid that we ought to make beginners in geometry draw the figures before proceeding to demonstrate, for in this way they would already feel geometrical truth before the demonstration brought them complete knowledge. In the same way, Schleiermacher speaks in his Critique of Ethics of logical and mathematical feeling, page 339, and also of the feeling of the sameness or difference of two formulas, page 342. Again, Tennemann, in his History of Philosophy, volume 1, page 361, says, "One felt that the fallacies were not right, but could not point out the mistakes." Now, so long as we do not regard this concept "feeling" from the right point of view, and do not recognize that one negative characteristic which alone is essential to it, it must constantly give occasion for misunderstanding and controversy, on account of the excessive wideness of its sphere, and its entirely negative and very limited content, which is determined in a purely one-sided manner. Since then we have in German the nearly synonymous word Empfindung, sensation, it would be convenient to make use of it for bodily feeling as a sub-species. This concept, feeling, which is quite out of proportion to all others, doubtless originated in the following manner. All concepts, and concepts alone, are denoted by words. They exist only for the reason, and proceed from it. With concepts, therefore, we are already at a one-sided point of view. But from such a point of view, what is near appears distinct and is set down as positive. What is farther off becomes mixed up, and is soon regarded as merely negative. Thus each nation calls all others foreign. To the Greek all others are barbarians. To the Englishman all that is not England or English is continent or continental. To the believer all others are heretics or heathens. To the noble all others are roturiers. To the student all others are Philistines, and so forth. Now, reason itself, strange as it may seem, is guilty of the same one-sidedness, indeed one might say of the same crude ignorance arising from vanity, for it classes under the one concept feeling. Every modification of consciousness which does not immediately belong to its own mode of apprehension, that is to say, which is not an abstract concept, it has had to pay the penalty of this hitherto in misunderstanding and confusion in its own province, because its own procedure had not become clear to it through thorough self-knowledge, for a special faculty of feeling has been set up, and new theories of it are constructed. Section 12. Rational knowledge, Wissen, is then all about abstract knowledge, that is, the knowledge which is peculiar to the reason as distinguished from the understanding. Its contradictory opposite has just been explained to be the concept feeling. Now, as reason only reproduces, for knowledge, what has been received in another way, it does not actually extend our knowledge, but only gives it another form. It enables us to know in the abstract and generally what first became known in sense perception, in the concrete. But this is much more important than it appears at first sight when so expressed, for it depends entirely upon the fact that knowledge has become rational or abstract knowledge, Wissen, that it can be safely preserved, that it is communicable and susceptible of certain and wide-reaching application to practice. Knowledge in the form of sense perception is valid only of the particular case, extends only to what is nearest, and ends with it, for sensibility and understanding can only comprehend one object at a time. Every enduring, arranged, and planned activity must therefore proceed from principles, that is, from abstract knowledge, and it must be conducted in accordance with them. Thus, for example, the knowledge of the relation of cause and effect arrived at by the understanding is in itself far completer, deeper, and more exhaustive than anything that can be thought about it in the abstract. The understanding alone knows in perception directly and completely the nature of the effect of a lever, of a pulley, or a cog-wheel, the stability of an arch, and so forth. But on account of the peculiarity of the knowledge of perception just referred to, that it only extends to what is immediately present, the mere understanding can never enable us to construct machines and buildings. Here reason must come in. It must substitute abstract concepts for ideas of perception, and take them as the guide of action. And if they are right, the anticipated result will happen. In the same way we have perfect knowledge in pure perception of the nature and constitution of the parabola, hyperbola, and spiral. But if we are to make trustworthy application of this knowledge to the real, it must first become abstract knowledge, and by this it certainly loses its character of intuition or perception. But on the other hand it gains the certainty and preciseness of abstract knowledge. The differential calculus does not really extend our knowledge of the curve. It contains nothing that was not already in the mere pure perception of the curve. But it alters the kind of knowledge, it changes the intuitive into an abstract knowledge, which is so valuable for application. But here we must refer to another peculiarity of our faculty of knowledge, which could not be observed until the distinction between the knowledge of the senses and understanding and abstract knowledge have been made quite clear. It is this, that relations of space cannot as such be directly translated into abstract knowledge, but only temporal qualities, that is, numbers are suitable for this. Numbers alone can be expressed in abstract concepts which accurately correspond to them, not spatial quantities. The concept 1,000 is just as different from the concept 10 as both these temporal qualities are in perception. We think of 1,000 as a distinct multiple of 10, into which we can resolve it at pleasure for perception in time. That is to say, we can count it. But between the abstract concept of a mile and that of a foot, apart from any concrete perception of either, and without the help of number, there is no accurate distinction corresponding to the quantities themselves. In both we only think of a spatial quantity in general, and if they must be completely distinguished we are compelled either to call in the assistance of intuition or perception in space, which would be a departure from abstract knowledge, or we must think the difference in numbers. If then we wish to have abstract knowledge of space relations, we must first translate them into time relations, that is, into numbers. Therefore only arithmetic, and not geometry, is the universal science of quantity, and geometry must be translated into arithmetic if it is to be communicable, accurately precise, and applicable in practice. It is true that a space relation as such may also be thought in the abstract. For example, the sine increases as the angle, but if the quantity of this relation is to be given, it requires number for its expression. This necessity, that if we wish to have abstract knowledge of space relations, in other words, rational knowledge, not mere intuition or perception, space with its three dimensions must be translated into time which has only one dimension. This necessity it is which makes mathematics so difficult. This becomes very clear if we compare the perception of curves with their analytical calculation, or the table of logarithms of the trigonometrical functions with the perception of the changing relations of the parts of a triangle, which are expressed by them. What vast mazes of figures, what laborious calculations it would require to express in the abstract what perception here apprehends at a glance completely and with perfect accuracy, namely, how the cosine diminishes as the sine increases, how the cosine of one angle is the sine of another, the inverse relation of the increase and decrease of the two angles, and so forth. How time, we might say, must complain, that with its one dimension it should be compelled to express the three dimensions of space. Yet this is necessary if we wish to possess, for application, an expression in abstract concepts of space relations. they could not be translated directly into abstract concepts, but only through the medium of the pure temporal quantity, number, which alone is directly related to abstract knowledge. Yet it is worthy of remark, that as space adapts itself so well to perception, and by means of its three dimensions even its complicated relations are easily apprehended, while it eludes the grasp of abstract knowledge, time, on the contrary, passes easily into abstract knowledge, but gives very little to perception. Our perceptions of numbers in their proper element, mere time, without the help of space, scarcely extends as far as 10, and beyond that we have only abstract concepts of numbers, no knowledge of them which can be presented in perception. On the other hand, we connect with every numeral, and with all algebraical symbols, accurately defined abstract concepts. We may further remark here that some minds only find full satisfaction in what is known through perception. What they seek is the reason and consequent of being in space, sensuously expressed. A demonstration after the manner of Euclid, or an arithmetical solution of spatial problems, does not please them. Other minds, on the contrary, seek merely the abstract concepts which are needful for applying and communicating knowledge. They have patience and memory for abstract principles, formulas, demonstrations in long trains of reasoning, and calculations, in which the symbols represent the most complicated abstractions. The latter seek preciseness, the former sensible perception. The difference is characteristic. The greatest value of rational or abstract knowledge is that it can be communicated and permanently retained. It is principally on this account that it is so inestimably important for practice. Any one may have a direct perceptive knowledge through the understanding alone, of the causal connection, of the changes and motions of natural bodies, and may find entire satisfaction in it. But he cannot communicate this knowledge to others until it has been made permanent for thought in concepts. Knowledge of the first kind is even sufficient for practice, if a man puts his knowledge into practice himself, in an action which can be accomplished while the perception is still vivid. But it is not sufficient if the help of others is required, or even if the action is his own, but must be carried out at different times, and therefore requires a preconceived plan. Thus, for example, a practised billiard player may have a perfect knowledge of the laws of the impact of elastic bodies upon each other, but merely in understanding, merely for direct perception, and for him it is quite sufficient. But on the other hand, it is only the man who has studied the science of mechanics, who has, properly speaking, a rational knowledge of these laws, that is, a knowledge of them in the abstract. Such knowledge of the understanding and perception is sufficient even for the construction of machines, when the inventor of the machine executes the work himself. As we often see in the case of talented workmen who have no scientific knowledge. But whenever a number of men, and their united action taking place at different times, is required for the completion of a mechanical work, of a machine, or a building, then he who conducts it must have thought out the plan in the abstract, and such cooperative activity is only possible through the assistance of reason. It is, however, remarkable that in the first kind of activity, in which we have supposed that one man alone, in an uninterrupted course of action, accomplishes something, abstract knowledge, the application of reason or reflection may often be a hindrance to him. For example, in the case of billiard playing, of fighting, of tuning an instrument, or in the case of singing. Here perceptive knowledge must directly guide action. Its passage through reflection makes it uncertain, for it divides the attention and confuses the man. Thus savages and untaught men, who are little accustomed to think, perform certain physical exercises, fight with beasts, shoot with bows and arrows, and the like, with a certainty and rapidity which the reflecting European never attains to, just because his deliberation makes him hesitate and delay. For he tries, for example, to hit the right position or the right point of time by finding out the mean between two false extremes, while the savage hits it directly without thinking of the false courses open to him. In the same way it is of no use to me to know in the abstract the exact angle, in degrees and minutes, at which I must apply a razor, if I do not know it intuitively, that is, if I have not got it in my touch. The knowledge of physiognomy also is interfered with by the application of reason. This knowledge must be gained directly through the understanding. We say that the expression, the meaning of the features, can only be felt, that is, it cannot be put into abstract concepts. Every man has his direct intuitive method of physiognomy and pathognomy, yet one man understands more clearly than another these signatura rerum. But an abstract science of physiognomy to be taught and learned is not possible, for the distinctions of difference are here so fine that concepts cannot reach them. Therefore abstract knowledge is related to them as a mosaic is to a painting by a Van der Werft or a Denner. In mosaics, however fine they may be, the limits of the stones are always there, and therefore no continuous passage from one colour to another is possible. And this is also the case with regard to concepts, with their rigidity and sharp delineation. However finely we may divide them by exact definition, they are still incapable of reaching the finer modifications of the perceptible, and this is just what happens in the example we have taken, knowledge of physiognomy. Footnote: I am therefore of opinion that a science of physiognomy cannot with certainty go further than to lay down a few quite general rules. For example, the intellectual qualities are to be read in the forehead and the eyes; the moral qualities, the expression of will, in the mouth and lower part of the face. The forehead and the eyes interpret each other. Either of them seen alone can only be half understood. Genius is never without a high, broad, finely arched brow. But such a brow often occurs where there is no genius. A clever-looking person may the more certainly be judged to be so the uglier the face is, and a stupid-looking person may the more certainly be judged to be stupid the more beautiful the face is. For beauty, as the approximation to the type of humanity, carries in and for itself the expression of mental clearness. The opposite is the case with ugliness, and so forth. End footnote. This quality of concepts, by which they resemble the stones of a mosaic, and on account of which perception always remains their asymptote, is also the reason why nothing good is produced in art by their means. If the singer or the virtuoso attempts to guide his execution by reflection, he remains silent; and this is equally true of the composer, the painter, and the poet. The concept always remains unfruitful in art. It can only direct the technical part of it. Its sphere is science. We shall consider more fully in the third book why all true art proceeds from sensuous knowledge, never from the concept. Indeed, with regard to behaviour also, and personal agreeableness in society, the concept has only a negative value in restraining the grosser manifestations of egotism and brutality, so that a polished manner is its commendable production. But all that is attractive, gracious, charming in behaviour, all affectionateness and friendliness, must not proceed from the concepts, for if it does, we feel intention and are put out of tune. All dissimulation is the work of reflection, but it cannot be maintained constantly and without interruption. Nemo potest personam Deo fere fictum, says Seneca in his book De Clementia, and so it is generally found out, and loses its effect. Reason is needed in the full stress of life, where quick conclusions, bold action, rapid and sure comprehension are required, but it may easily spoil all if it gains the upper hand, and by perplexing hinders the intuitive, direct discovery and grasp of the right by simple understanding, and thus induces irresolution. Lastly, virtue and holiness do not proceed from reflection, but from the inner depths of the will, and its relation to knowledge. The exposition of this belongs to another part of our work. This, however, I may remark here, that the dogmas relating to ethics may be the same in the reason of the whole nations, but the action of every individual different. And the converse also holds good. Action, we say, is guided by feelings, that is, simply not by concepts, but as a matter of fact by the ethical character. Dogmas occupy the idle reason, but action in the end pursues its own course independently of them, generally not according to abstract rules, but according to unspoken maxims, the expression of which is the whole man himself. Therefore, however different the religious dogmas of nations may be, yet in the case of all of them, a good action is accompanied by unspeakable satisfaction, and a bad action by endless remorse. No mockery can shake the former, no priest's absolution can deliver from the latter. Notwithstanding this, we must allow that for the pursuit of a virtuous life the application of reason is needful. Only it is not its source, but has the subordinate function of preserving resolutions which have been made, of providing maxims to withstand the weakness of the moment, and give consistency to action. It plays the same part ultimately in art also, where it has just as little to do with the essential matter, but assists in carrying it out, for genius is not always at call, and yet the work must be completed in all its parts and rounded off to a whole. Footnote: refer to Chapter 7 of the supplement. End of first book, first aspect, sections 10 through 12. Recording by Bill Borst.